Hi, everybody. This is Jason Mefford. I received a question on one of the previous videos that I've done. So I thought I'd go through and read the question and then have this video help to explain and provide the answer, because I'm guessing some of you may have this same question. So the question came in, it's from Vinod Andari. And they say, how do you consider OCEG capability model in terms of implementations? Does this guide on how to set up EGRC or integrated risk management or define standard controls where UCF or the Unified Compliance Framework also considers this as part of unification of controls on compliance requirements? If I were to design EGRC, is this one of the authority documents / standards guidelines in addition to NIST, ISO, etc.? Totally confused on usage of OCEG. Okay, so let me go through and just kind of explain here, because there's a couple of things going on. So the first one is to make sure that you're clear on the difference between mandatory and voluntary requirements. So when you're talking about compliance, we usually refer to something as being a mandatory compliance. So that would be things like laws and regulations, those things that your organization has to follow. Voluntary are other documents your organization chooses to follow. So for example, an ISO standard is usually not required. The OCEG framework is usually not required. So both of those would be considered voluntary versus, maybe like a privacy law in your country would be considered something to be mandatory. So first off, like I said, you have to remember and keep straight the difference between mandated or mandatory and voluntary, okay? Now, the second thing, there was a reference in here to UCF, or the Unified Compliance Framework. So what UCF does is it is a tool that allows you to select different documents, and I'm going to use the term authority documents. So an authority document could be a mandated compliance requirement, or it could be voluntary. But it's a document that it's an authority document that you are choosing to comply with, either because it's mandatory or voluntary. Now, what UCF does is they take the language from each of those authority documents and they map them back to the same list of common controls. So, for example, a lot of the ISO documents, one that Vinod also referred to as NIST, and OCEG, those are all documents in the UCF framework that you can select. So what you decide is say, okay, if I need to follow NIST, I add that to my list. If I need to follow ISO standards, then I'll add those to it. If I want to follow the OCEG framework, you can also add that to it. Now, what the UCF tool does is it takes all of those different mandates or things that you are asked to do, and it maps them back to the same list of common controls. And so you can use that tool as a way to help you kind of deduplicate and figure out exactly what it is that you need to do. Because every time that you add a new authority document, it doesn't mean that you have to do maybe 300 new things. There may only be 50 new things that you have to do because you're already doing 250 of them. So like I said, to start with, there's a difference between mandated and voluntary. And then that's a little overview of what the UCF framework does for organizations. So you need to decide which authority documents you want to comply with. And so the question was about the OCEG framework. And so this is the OCEG GRC Capability Model. And this is one of the frameworks that I helped to develop. Now, you also need to think about the G, the R, and the C in GRC. The OCEG model is intended for you to help you in developing an integrated GRC capability. And what that means is that the different silos or functions or departments or whatever you call them in your organization are working together. So that framework, or I'll use that word framework or model for them, has different components and elements that you need to include to kind of have a complete picture for GRC. So if you, for example, compare OCEG's model to an ISO standard, you may notice that the OCEG model is more broad because it's trying to be for the whole of GRC, not for a particular thing. Like ISO 27001 only relates to ISMS, or Information Security Management Systems, okay? So you'll notice that the OCEG model would bring in more things than just ISO 27001 by itself. So there's the list of components and elements that you need to have in place. And in the OCEG model, there is also what are called implementation or design considerations when you are designing controls. So if you want to use the OCEG model as one of the authority documents and you're using UCF, you would select that in your list of authority documents that you want to comply with. Now, what it'll do is all of those actions and controls will be mapped back to that same list of common controls that the UCF has, okay? So hopefully that helps in trying to answer this. You know, the question about around eGRC. I guess let me touch on that before I sign off here too. eGRC usually is relating to kind of the IT component to it. So the GRC software that you are using. Now, if you also want to follow the OCEG guidelines, and yes, I would suggest that you include that in or consider that with some of those other things that you're looking at. It's not required. It's a voluntary thing that your organization can choose to follow, just like NIST or ISO or some of these other voluntary things. But it is another option for you to be able to do that. So hopefully that helps. If there's other questions about it, please leave a comment below and I'll get it answered for you.